good?
Yep, we can see it.
Great, thanks. So I'm just going to start by pointing out that we have a fairly optimistic view of things because our talk is called Solving the Climate Challenge. That's what we're dedicated to. We're not protesting, we're not knocking down anything. We don't want to be against, we want to be for. And I'll note that today we're at 418 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. And next slide, please. So we'll introduce ourselves. I'm not quite the head of the entire organization of Citizens Climate Lobby, which is 200,000 people strong. I'm a local chapter leader, volunteer based in Princeton, and I've recently become the state coordinator for New Jersey, which is quite a lot of cats to herd. And I will now let Eric, my background is architecture, leadership and environmental and energy design, passed the exam a long time ago. And I will let Eric introduce himself. Thanks.
Yeah, so I am a recent member of the Princeton chapter. I joined about 2 years ago, right before we shut down. So I had the opportunity to go to the last 2 or 3 in-person meetings and spent most of the pandemic getting to know the fellow members over our monthly Zoom calls. My own background is electrical engineering, and now I'm a software engineer. So I am familiar with the Trenton Computer Fair. I used to come to buy oscilloscopes and that kind of thing, and I think I've just sold off a few of them on Craigslist fairly recently. So I was very happy to be invited to talk today.
Next slide. Yes, here's a photo from the many years in which we have been able to go as a national and international group to Washington to gather there and meet with all every office in Congress. Or if there were a few that didn't have time to meet with us, we would bring materials, and we filled the hallways. A lot of that has changed in the last couple of years due to invading viruses and invading rebels, but we will be going back to Washington this June. And our founder, who we will talk about a little later because he had some great ideas, was known to have pointed out that he became concerned about climate change, and he thought, well, it was so important, somebody must be doing something about it. So he said he used to think that the important people were taking care of the important things, and he didn't think that after a while. He wanted to start an organization that teaches all of us to lobby Congress on the issues that were of primary importance to us, and we feel to everyone. So you can proceed, Eric. Thanks. So our agenda for today then is to mention a few nearby regional climate change impacts that some of you may have experienced, and to talk about the congressional legislation that we would like to see happen and which we've been working with for several years. And finally, just a little organizational information, since it's an organization made up of all people like us. Thank you. So the most dramatic or understandable material issue is the buildup of carbon dioxide in the air. And the graph you see there is something called the Keeling curve, which is more like a straight line. And it's going from the age when I was a tiny tot till now, showing the increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide molecules in the air. So that was measured in a very pollution-free area of Hawaii, and the global average before the steam engine came up was about 280 parts per million. Since then, at least one political group has determined that 350 was a good goal. But as I mentioned in the concentration at the beginning slide of 418, we have blown past that number, unfortunately. And that's why we're all working so hard. Next, please. Thank you. So in the US, the EPA has been tracking and reporting on a lot of the progress, or at least the continuation of the situation. And the graph on the left shows how much of the emissions have come from the various sectors of carbon dioxide producing activities. And you can see in the round pie chart there that most of that is coming from combustion of fossil fuels. I have to look real closely to see what else. That there's an energy sector, and which is smaller. And then there's also the waste processes. But by and large, most of the global warming situation comes from combustion of fossil fuels. And just to go over the basics of that, as we go along, I'll mention a few things. I doubt that anyone here will find it news. The graph on the right shows that the sources have maintained pretty much a constant percentage of the emissions that our country provides, but that the bottom layer, which is electric power from fossil fuel combustion, is becoming the least important, is decreasing. And that's of course because of the rise in renewable energy sources, our ability to produce electricity from solar and wind, and perhaps soon offshore wind as well. So the basics of this slide are sort of illustrating what the problem is when you just keep burning ancient energy and releasing it into the atmosphere. And I see questions coming in. I'm very grateful for that, but I will hold off, I think, till we get a little further along. Eric and I will try to respond to those. So as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased, the planet's gotten warmer. It's very hard to warm such a giant planet, which is mostly water. And so that has happened because of the greenhouse effect, which has been known about for, a century. And the CO2 gas molecules absorb infrared light, and the rest of the sun's visible light comes through to the Earth's surface and is absorbed. And then it would be also sent out again. But by then, there's too much CO2, which is a very heat absorbing molecule. It acts like a thicker and thicker blanket. So each time we increase the concentration of that, our blanket gets heavier and more dense and retains more energy. That's why what sounds like small amounts of increase, a degree Celsius, which is almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, it sounds so small, and it would be small in an average day, but it's happening all over the globe. And there are places where the heat rise is more extreme due to albedo effects and so on, and places where it's a little less. So the average is really representing an enormous amount of energy that's been put back into the atmosphere from, dinosaur remains and plants from millions of years ago. That's putting us into imbalance. So I think we could go on to the next slide. We sort of covered the basics. So this is a local effect. The people at Princeton University took a very interesting local site, which many of us have actually in the past been able to ice skate on for very long distances. And they started measuring through archives such as the Town Topics newspaper, whether the river Carnegie Lake had frozen enough that year or how many times for people to ice skate on. And you can see the graph line is distinctly taking a downward curve. We wish that that curve applied to CO2, but it applies to the freezing abilities of this body of water. And it's a very tangible experience for those of us in the area, or anyone, in New Jersey who might be skating on local bodies of water. So that is local enough for, I think, many of you to relate to. And Eric has identified another local effect.
Yeah, so I like the idea. Callie actually wrote a letter to the editor about that study, and it does help to think about things that we have connection to. So I was also thinking about the way I'm experiencing climate change locally, and my family has been in the Philadelphia area as long as I can remember. So the Jersey Shore, I have photographs going back to when my grandparents were small, visiting the Jersey Shore in the summertime, right? So tidal flooding, I think, is something that's very much on the minds of New Jersey legislatures, and tidal flooding is the fact that this graphic from NOAA is showing the fact that at the sea levels in 1950, it would have taken a considerable storm surge to reach a flooding level where we're getting water into the streets and to buildings. By 2010, that buffer has been reduced. So just the notion of some strong high tides actually gets us to the point where flooding. So this is sort of tidal nuisance flooding that's just happening more frequently because of sea level rise. So I went and found some photos of different members of my family that were taken in the Jersey Shore, down in Atlantic City, in different places, just thinking about this effect. So, and I found this study that talks about the number of days where we'll have more than minor nuisance tidal flooding in Atlantic City projected forward, right? So at the bottom is the historical count up till 2020. And certainly there are occurrences of tidal flooding going way back to the 1930s, but they're coming forward recently. We're starting to see them more frequently. And I think the thing of real concern then is going forward in the top graph from 2020. In the worst case, by the end of the century, there's basically tidal flooding every day in Atlantic City. And even in a more moderate case, we see an increase throughout. So this points to challenges. Now, I don't know from the study like what area this covers. It's just more than minor, but I expect that the correlation of the number of days that this happens probably coincides with like a wider area of it happening. So yeah, this was something that sort of gave me thought, because my family's been going there for almost 100 years, right? And looking forward, are my kids going to be able to do the same, or what is it going to look like? It feels like it's going to be very different. So zooming out a little bit, another study I found was related to this, but breaking down flooding by county in New Jersey. And there's this notion they define of operational risk, where a facility is flooded to the point where it can no longer function as intended. So this is firststreet.org. They presented a map that heat colors where this problem is going to be most pronounced. So Cape May County, maybe not surprisingly, has as much as, so they broke the infrastructure into different categories, like residential properties and miles of road that can be are at operational risk going forward. So this is over just a 30-year time period. And in Cape May County, there's as much as over 50% of residential properties are could be affected by this. So this is interesting too, because the ocean counties are, I think, not surprisingly at risk, but you also have counties on the Delaware. Hunterdon County has a lot of infrastructure at risk as well. So then, just going forward, we're just trying to think about this locally. So CCL compiled other effects that we expect to see in the Northeast and the New Jersey region in the Mid-Atlantic. So higher temperatures, 2 degrees by 2035, more precipitation, increased risk of flooding. I feel like this is something where we're definitely already seeing these sort of large summer storms that cause flash flooding. They feel different than when I was a kid, and they feel like they're happening more frequently. Sea level rise is actually higher than average right now along New Jersey. I don't totally understand the reason behind that. There's pointing to Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets melting. So I see that sea level rise is obviously a concern, but it's actually happening a little bit faster than here than on the global average. High tide flooding we talked about already, and stronger hurricanes. I mean, we're reminded even last year with Hurricane Ida what that can look like and the damage we're going to anticipate is going to be very costly. So how long do we have? So I think everybody here listening to the talks earlier, this is already well known, but the idea of being down 50% by 2030 in carbon emissions is sort of well established. There's lots of state legislation now that's trying to mandate this target. So it's not a lot of time. I was thinking about this, and the class of 2030 is in 4th grade right now. So your time is short to make that target. And Eric talked about this at length, but the policies that we're putting in place today affect that. We can't go to 2029, obviously, and then cut by 50%. There's infrastructure that's being put in place today. And you see this in various stories in the news. The United States Postal Service is in sort of an infuriating way deciding to buy very inefficient trucks. The last I looked at this on one of the tech websites, and you're faced with either being stuck with these in 2030 or purchasing new ones again. And you see lots of news stories talking about calling a moratorium for new fossil fuel, either power generation or hookups to new construction. So this is something that's also frequently in the news. And the basic idea is, obviously, the more of this we put in place, the deeper the hole we're digging ourselves in. So there's lots of things that have to be done, and I think this is better covered by Eric and some of the previous talks. But we need sort of all things at once. And there's no one solution. We need kind of all of the above, as Eric talked about. So one question as a citizens group that wants to do something that's effective is to think about, kind of brainstorm on what makes a good solution to get behind politically. So obviously the thing we're concerned about, we want to drive this change quickly. We would like to make the 50% target by 2030. So it has to be effective. It has to be equitable. There's no real politically durable way to get anything done if we don't take account of those who can at least afford a solution. So this is another practical concern of getting something done at the federal level. It has to be healthy for the economy. It's hard to convince people today to take a hit, even though it's we've been hearing for 30 years that the longer we wait to do something, the more expensive it gets. It's always hard to get people to act immediately if it means an adverse effect on their pocketbook. I talked about durability. We want to have federal legislation that can stick around and is just not at the whims of each different administration that comes in. And we want incentives too that supply choice. This kind of goes along lines of being nonpartisan. We'll talk about more of that later. So a price on carbon with appropriate measures to address competitiveness and equity is arguably the best place to start. And this is really the central idea of the legislation that CCL is behind, and I think that that's what we're going to talk about now. So I'll give it back to you, Callie.
Thank you, Eric. So this is a picture of part of Congress, and this is showing the sponsors, the original sponsors gathering together to support HR 2307, which is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. This is actually a reintroduced bill. It was previously introduced in the previous Congress in 2019, and at that time was original sponsors were bipartisan. They were both from Florida, and the current sponsor is Ted Deutsch, and he was joined back then by Francis Rooney. And both of them understand that Florida is one of the states at highest risk. Sometimes we call it ground zero for climate change because of the nature of its geology. the way water will just rise underneath it instead of around it. So no seawalls will help. And it was wonderful to have all that support, but the bill became kind of Democrat heavy, although the structure of the bill is very much designed to appeal across the board and is supported outside of Congress by many conservatives and economists of all stripes. The basic idea of this bill is to put a price on carbon and return it to households. It's based on a principle called carbon fee and dividend, on the principle of taxing something you don't want in order to reduce its use and avoid the harm of higher costs by returning, as it says here, 100% of the revenue. Oh yeah, it's like 98% when you take out administrative costs to households, in which everybody will be given the same amount as an individual, half of the amount to children. And for example, Elon Musk and you would each get the same amount per year. And he could probably afford it if his carbon footprint is bigger than that. So there's the beginning of the bill. Of the policy is to collect a fee, actually, not free, from the the market for fossil fuels is, not populated by small businesses. It's a few giant companies. And therefore, since we know the content of their product that they're extracting, when it goes into the market, they can be charged according to the carbon intensiveness of that fuel. So coal, the most, coal's going away anyway. Oil is the next densest, and then so-called natural gas, which is methane, a greenhouse gas, that is also taxed according to its density, which is slightly less. And all of that money goes into a trust fund and then is redistributed much the same way that your pandemic impact checks arrived. So we certainly, the bill works out all of the administrative details, and it does not grow the government, which is key for conservatives and Republicans. And that is where we start, has always been $15 per metric ton. This may require raising because of the number of years that this bill has been proposed and without getting so far implemented into anything like the Build Back Better bill that was pretty much knocked over. The increased prices are intended to be passed through from the giant fuel companies to the customers so that everything goes downstream from there. Every product that's made with a slightly more expensive fossil fuel, the people who make those products or buy materials will be looking for a cleaner sourced, therefore lower priced substitute. And that is a feature of the policy. It means that we all see the visible social cost of using fossil fuels. And yet the $15 a ton does not obviously reflect that anymore. So we will go up $10 or $15 each year when it's passed. And then the dividend, that's the next slide, I think, Eric, is as I described, meant to make up to at least the lowest 2/3 of our economy. The folks making that income will find that they're breaking even or even doing a little better by getting this household check each week, each month. And it is designed to, the check is designed to, in the bill, to come before the price increase occurs. So that we think that will make it both progressive and also durable, because it's very popular if people are receiving money on a steady basis. It's not hidden in a tax credit or anything that doesn't apply to the lowest income people, and that helps cement this policy into permanence, unlike an executive order. Finally, this is a key point about this type of price on carbon. Eric, next slide. Is that it is, if you create an internal price on carbon to a country, then you can also get it implemented as a border protection for your manufacturers, your own national companies that export to other countries. If you don't have a carbon fee yourself, then that is considered a punitive tariff. So it would also, not only would it help our businesses, it would motivate other countries, other than the 40 who already have a carbon fee, carbon price in place. It would encourage the rest of the world to also make these improvements, and then they would have an even marketplace in the US. Carbon border adjustments are complicated, but they're really they're dependent on having an established price on carbon. And it's an essential part of this bill. And I think we're turning it over to Eric.
Right, so I just comment on those two items really quickly. I feel like the dividend with the carbon fee addresses some of the fear that a lot of people like to raise when they hear about carbon prices going up. The fact that it's a feature to increase fossil fuel prices, the dividend addresses that, and that's a buzzsaw criticism that a lot of policies that run into, and that's one of the effective parts that I like about this bill, that I think makes it a nice idea. And the border adjustment also, you often hear the immediate criticism of what good is it for the United States to act alone if the rest of the world is not alone. Well, we have the opportunity to use our market as leverage to try to prompt other countries to adopt a similar policy. And actually, we're a little bit behind the ball, as Callie mentioned. There's a lot of countries that are already doing some carbon pricing. So those are two nice things about it. So as a new member of this bill, and this is the first time I've sort of spoken publicly on behalf of CCL, I kind of wanted to get some independent, sort of trusted assessment that this sounds better than just me sitting at home saying, aha, seems like a good idea. So I reached out to look for some information, and this is a study by the Columbia Center for Global Energy Policy. And as luck would have it, they directly made an assessment of this bill that we're supporting. And I just want to share a few of the nice results that are in this study. So one is a comparison of carbon emissions going forward if we have the business as usual case or if the bill is implemented. And this graph is showing on the bottom, our electric generation sector is really impacted heavily by this bill. This is where we get most of the bang for the buck over the first 10 years that it's implemented. There are other sectors that we mentioned earlier, like transportation is lumped into this higher sector. The effect is not as immediate there, but it's still in the right direction. And this is a composition. So this is comparing what our electrical generation composition looks like with and without the bill. The study was done in 2019. So this is a little bit behind. This would be if the bill had been passed at that time and the fee started in 2020. So the first two columns we'll just say are a comparison of the effect in the first year if we were to introduce something like that. And the composition of energy, so if we look at one stack, we're saying this far left column is how we generate our electricity, right? There's nuclear, there's renewables, there's natural gas, there's coal. So even in the first year, there's the two compositions look pretty much the same, but coal does take a pretty quick hit. And then going out 10 years, we see a much bigger effect. So the two things that are very desirable about this is, I mean, if you look at the current business as usual policy, we're not that much different 10 years out if we don't implement something like this, some incentive to get to cleaner electricity generation. So what we really see is a more pronounced effect with renewables growing at a much higher rate, and coal really being reduced to a very sliver amount. And I think this is, I keep, as I've been involved with CCL, it seems like getting our electricity generation on the right foot is sort of like the low-hanging fruit. We just have to get to it if we can. So that doesn't mean there's not challenges, but this is the first 10 years of carbon reduction. Really, a lot of it can be done through that sector. So one other concern with this is the equitable part. The bill does basically, it makes it a feature that price for gas, price for utilities is going to go up. We want to signal that we want to start getting away from these things, and we want to give people the opportunity to find ways to get away from them. And right. So one of the concerns is, well, what's the distribution of what kind of fees can we expect to be a result of assessing this fee on carbon producers, fossil fuel producers, and what sort of dividend could we expect to receive back on the monthly payment? So these are annual averages. So in the first year, it would be around roughly $500 some in increased expenditures and a dividend around 600. Going 10 years out, as the fee increases, we're up to around $3,000. But even in the average case, the dividend is larger than the expenditure. This is an average across income scale. So if you break income scales down into fifths and you're looking at the lowest 1/5 income, the differential is actually higher. The dividend payment there's a bigger spread where the dividend payment is higher than the increased expenditure, which is a feature that you want to have. You want to protect the people who already really struggle to make utility payments, and where fueling cars is like an essential thing they have to do. It's not going to be a popular policy if we drive those costs too high to handle. So there are other parts of this that I was interested in, and this may be a lot of detail, but another thing I was interested in was this idea of no policy being a silver bullet. There's lots of things that have to be done, and CCL, although we're supporting this legislation, and we think it is the most effective way to sort of get the ball rolling, there are complementary things that can be done. And another study by the same group at Columbia sort of took a look at this notion, ranking other policies that could be put in place that would be complementary to the Carbon Fee and Dividend Act, and things that are sort of just overlap in the same ways that wouldn't have much additional effect. I just wanted to put this out there because I think sometimes there's a criticism like, we just passed this and everything's going to be great, and that's not the case. But this bill, I think, generates support and hopefully sort of a catalyst to have some of these other things done. So things like, I mean, an obvious one is fossil fuel subsidies are sort of like an anti-fee, the exact opposite of what we want to do. So obviously, if that were removed, that would just go along the same way of making fossil fuel prices reflect the actual costs to society. So one other useful tool that I have been introduced to through some of the CCL meetings is there's another organization that has developed this web application. They're affiliated with MIT and Climate Interactive. The three companies are there on the right. But there's basically it's basically an application that gives you a way to be king for the day and decide if you had the sole power to enact climate change legislation, which knobs would be the right ones to turn to be the most effective. And it breaks this into different categories like energy supply, transportation, land and industrial emissions, right? So behind this application too, so you play with these various inputs, and then you can look at distinct outputs like flooding maps in New Jersey, say, and see what the different changes of inputs, how they would impact, say, saving land from operational flood risk, for example. And the other point of this is, so the web interface is connected to basically a lot of research, the latest research and models that the makers of this connect together. So I'm not saying that I am I'm definitely not an expert in this area. I'm just trying to reflect another tool that's available to kind of look at these things. And one of the most interesting parts of this, in terms of the idea that we're supporting, is if you play with this at all for some time, and on the energy supply side, you do have the opportunity to enact a carbon price, or you can do things like heavily regulate coal, oil, natural gas, all of our energy sector portfolio items. And at least with this simulator, it tends to reflect, and I think this is still true the last time you used it, the temperature that's shown at the top right here is basically what that policy will limit the maximum temperature rise to. So the carbon price by itself under the simulation has more effect than trying to maximize regulation against each of the independent input energy categories alone. So this is just another way for someone who's new to this to look at this and say, okay, this is, there are experts who think this is a good idea. There's simulations that sort of support carbon fee and dividend as being something that can be effective. And the last sort of less wonky thing that I wanted to point out, there's a book called The Case for Carbon Dividends. I think it's from 2012 or 2014. I heard the author, James Boyce, actually speak at one of the CCL events. And I found getting away from sort of the Columbia style reports and just having a very readable, it's about 100 pages long, argument for carbon dividends. This was a great read. So for someone who's on the fence or wants to kind of understand how it works better, this is recommended. And lastly, so the bill as it stands, these are the current supporters in Congress. So I think we're up to 95. I think I got an email today that there was a new one, so I'm not sure if this is quite up to date. There were 24 original co-sponsors. As Callie mentioned, these are all Democrats if you look closely. There was a Republican co-sponsor in the original bill, but as we talked about, I think that CCL is focused on being nonpartisan. Certainly, we feel that this bill has the capacity to be supported by Republicans, and there is support in conservative circles for it outside of Congress right now. So anyway, so these are the names that are for it right now. Locally, in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, these are the representatives that have signed on to it. Where I personally am in New Jersey 12, so Bonnie Watson Coleman has supported it both times, and we're very grateful for her willingness to meet with us and to support the legislation. So I'll hand it back to Callie to talk about our organization now.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, a question or a comment that came in from David in our audience gives me a great chance to respond. He asks if it's true that CCL substantially increased performance with calls, texts, and emails to legislators at about 1,000% increase in 2021 compared to the year before. And that is true. We've always steadily produced letters to the editor, media articles, op-eds when we have special knowledge. We've worked very hard on grassroots outreach and grass tops to gain support from other leaders, such as mayors, such as small businesses, wineries, coffee shops, etc. And we've had union support from this, I think it's the second largest educational union in the country, and 100 cities have endorsed. So last fall and last spring, summer and fall, we had a major move on because of the advent of the Build Back Better bill. And we did phone and text and write to every member of Congress supporting, asking them to support a price on carbon in as general a mode as we could. We generated 50,000 calls, and that was maximum effort. As you know, there's been a bit of a roadblock. Sometimes opposition comes from unexpected quarters, but our chapters in West Virginia couldn't have been working harder. They produced videos of various constituents asking for action against climate change. And, you know, we are just keeping on. We also are going to broaden our focus. I mean, our strength has been our focus, but we also know that we have now become large enough to afford several pro-climate directions. So we're working on that as well. And it is past time, as we all know. That's why many of us were very glad to find Citizens Climate Lobby. So it's got 425 chapters now across the US and a total of 500 worldwide. We have overseas chapters as well. And we've been able to learn a great deal. This is an organization that supports its volunteers and doesn't sit around waiting for you to write a check. It empowers us. And many of us had never visited Congress or our offices there, or regional, you know, offices such as in the district here in New Jersey. And we've all learned that we have the right to do that. And we bring polite, well-organized, respectful appreciation, so that offices in Congress have often said they'd rather meet with us than people who are screaming and kicking. So we've all become empowered in ways that would work on many causes, but we've all felt that climate change is the central, most important thing to address at this time. And we have chapter meetings in our local districts. New Jersey has about 10 chapters, and they are doing as much as they can, especially during the whole shutdown. We couldn't table as much, but we did a lot of outreach via this method, Zoom. So I appreciate all of you being here today. As a matter of fact, for lobbying, last year we did 1,668 lobby meetings on Zoom. We wrote almost 75,000 letters to Congress. We had editorials, op-eds and letters. I actually don't have the number of editorials we got supporting us, but there were 4,237 published media pieces, and endorsements are in the 2000s from community leaders everywhere. And we are often given the opportunity in something called CCL University to learn or reinforce another skill. I'm sure many of us never thought we would even lead a group. So, we've got some other questions coming in. So I think we can go to the next slide, which talks about chapters.
I think you covered a lot of that. I mean,
yes.
Really, I think you hit basically a lot of the rest of what we have. I just like to get to my own experience in looking at some of these slides. You know, I think that the lobbying Congress was really attractive to me when I got involved with this. I certainly have never sat in a lobbying meeting or thought to do so before I was part of this organization. And it strikes me that Marshall Saunders, this was one of the ideas that he had, and it really is innovative because you know, ultimately, I think CCL, the focus is on getting federal legislation. There's the realization that this has to be done at the highest level, and that has to be passed through our current legislators. We have to talk to them directly. And the notion that there's already this organization that has chosen an effective way to deal with climate change and is really focused on doing that through the process is given me a hopeful outlet for trying to make something like this happen. It feels much more effective than just hand-wringing and endlessly reading about the latest IPCC report. And I've also learned a lot through it. I mean, the members of this organization are all concerned about climate change. They all have different opinions about lots of things about it, but the dialogue in the monthly meetings is very good, and the whole organization is set up with the monthly meetings. It's not just a powwow with your local team. There is a national speaker from all sorts of different collaborative sort of organizations that you find out about. So it's not only helped me to become engaged with the work that we're doing, but to be more informed about it. So most of the rest of our slides, I think, are talking about specifically, like, if you participate in the meetings, what we're really trying to do is garner support for this approach to climate change. And we do that through, writing letters to the editor. We certainly have social media campaigns, and there are people with different facilities for doing that. Local leaders, we want to have, of course, numbers are important for bending our legislators' ear, but it's nice to have local business leaders and local politicians. We try to get before city councils and mayors to adopt resolutions in support of our approach. And we do today is a perfect example of an outreach meeting. We want to get the word out and do presentations for people. Certainly we're looking for people who are looking for ways to sort of multiply how they can be effective in working to solve climate change. And there are other pieces of the legislation that, if they are congruent with the things that we would like to do, we will advocate for those as well. And this garners support with our legislators who are for this bill. They see that we're not here just for our one narrow sort of cause. We're more being engaged with them. We're more aware of what is actually being suggested and passed through federal legislators. So it's an opportunity to help support them in ways they can be grateful for. And Callie already mentioned the call effort that we had last year got a lot of attention. So that was sort of my feeling of being a participant. I've definitely enjoyed it, and that's all I have to say.
Yes, and it will only get more interesting as we are able to get back in person, because people do like to see one another, and going to Congress is usually a highlight of the year. Yes, we do want to say that it's about empowering you as an individual, and that CCL's higher level ambition is to develop the political will to address climate change. And we'll do it however we deem best, while keeping to our principles of inclusion, of respect, of nonpartisanship, and looking for what binds us all together. So there's some links for information about the bill and the organization. And you are certainly invited to, I guess we can, I could put those in the chat and we can move on to the next slide. Eric, thank you. We're going to be in Washington again together in June, having missed 2 or more of our national conferences that would have been in person. I must say, being a member of the organization helped keep things feeling a little more normal during the shutdown, because we had been using Zoom, speaking of technology, Zoom, and before that, cell phones to have the national call. They're based in California, so we have been at least using that kind of technology for years. And our next visit, you can still be there in plenty of time if you sign up at that link for our conference. And lobby day will be held with any chapter that has enough people there to meet in person. Otherwise, we'll do it again as via Zoom. We'll meet with about 400 offices. And it seems like a good time to support our members of Congress with a friendly invasion. So the last steps are, I know we only have a few minutes left for questions, so I'll finish up fast. If you're thinking in terms of actions you can take, Eric, I think the next slide will have that question. You might be thinking, well, I don't know enough about this group yet, but in general, all we ask of any one of you who's expressed the kind of concern that brings you here today is that you talk about climate change, because it tends to be swept under the rug and yet has become also, I think, a vital part of the conversation, given the deplorable situation in Europe right now, that we know that we have maybe put too much power into the hands of people who control these fossil fuel sources. And, you know, sunlight and wind are really hard to capture. They are everywhere. You cannot take them over. So I think that discussion is coming to the fore. And then I know we have to go real fast. Eric, we can just pay a quick tribute to Marshall Saunders, who was the founder of CCL. He was a developer who got interested in the cause of world hunger and began doing great things about that. And after about 10 years, he realized climate change could undo everything he had helped to do to reduce hunger. So he moved into this world and created Citizens Climate Lobby based on the process of educating all of us regular people. So we became the important people taking care of the important problems. All of you are. And as he said, what we do and do not do really counts. We're all in it. And I think that's just a thank you slide after this. And if we can check in with the comments from David, for example, who sent a link of congressional testimony by fossil fuel industry executives. David, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question. If you're, I see you are here. And the question is, yeah, ready to go?
I was just wondering if you would recommend those viewing or interested to view that testimony. There's a lot to be learned, even if you can only spend an hour or two watching the first hour or two. It's a lot to be learned in that time frame. But it's a pretty lengthy visit.
Yeah, those go on a long time. I'm sure at least part of that could be illuminating if the students are learning to listen critically to things that people say who are, you know, ostensibly important in our world, because it would be a good chance to use your debating skills and try to tease out what's really true about what they're saying and what might be a little bit of greenwashing. So I'd certainly recommend it. I'd recommend it to anyone. Family Zoom has commented, thank you for thanking us. We thank you. And it's good to have fossil fuel reflect their social costs. And Family Zoom is concerned about gas oil prices already going up because of other factors. And then there's also inflation. It could be politically more challenging to get the bill through. Focusing on the dividend, as you suggest, is absolutely key. In some states who are working on this as a state policy, they're calling it carbon cashback, just putting that cash right up front. And that's probably a wise thing to do, although I thought energy innovation was a nice part of the bill name that we support. Yeah, and also it's become sort of patriotic now that, you know, if we're paying more for gasoline, as Europe has for years, then we're also supporting a war effort, as we did during World War II. But I mean, all of these events are sort of raw and unprocessed at the moment. And, you know, in our work as an organization, what we're focusing on now is just reminding people that climate change isn't going away just because there's a crisis in the world. Suki, I think that's Matt Wasserman. Hey, Matt. Without a cap or market-based fee, how much teeth does this act really give to lower greenhouse gases? It actually does, because 60% of our economy is business, and the businesses are not getting a check the way you would be. So it's going to really push businesses that plan ahead gently and gradually in the direction of finding cleaner sources for everything, or operating cleanly if they are in fact, I guess it's the companies that produce a product that you end up burning. They have to figure out, make technological innovations to clean up and lower the cost of their own product. There's a lot of information online should you need that. Eric, did you want to comment on any of these as well?
No, I would say about that too. I think in the book that I talked about too, there like the detail between, so not really a cap and trade in the way it's usually thought of, like energy companies sort of negotiating who gets to burn what, but the sort of fee to fossil fuel companies and then the dividend back to people. There are variations on the way this is applied, and certainly there is some guesswork. I think we were touching on it. What this bill that is written introduces, it's $15 a year, and it's supposed to go up 10 or 15 dependent on whether we make a target reduction. So it's higher if we've missed. Obviously, it would be there could be improvements of just restricting to the amount that we would like to have. I think part of the calculation, my understanding, is politically being able to describe this is important. But yeah, it's a fair question.
It always comes up, and it is very important to deal with. And sorry, thank you for bringing it up. And it looks like we've run a couple of minutes over. You all want time to stretch before our keynote speaker, Bob Kopp from Rutgers. So thank you so much for your time with us, and put on your avatar and stretch. Okay.
We are very grateful for your talk, the enlightenment you've given us, and the push for activism, for increased activism. Thank you both, Callie and Eric.
Thank you, Karen and group. And we'll see you at the finale.
Yes.
Thank you, guys.
7 or 8